So let me ask you a question about a comment that you made in the Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss about LSD as a potential treatment for dyslexia. Now, I don't have all of the context, but I pulled this out, and this is going to lead to a broader question about perhaps unusual or unexpected applications or indications for psychedelics. But this section here reads, "It did lead me to speculate about the use of LSD as a potential treatment for dyslexia. We have a limited understanding of neuroplasticity, to say nothing of how psychedelics might affect it. That man's anecdote," so of course I've omitted an anecdote, "hints at the curious link between psychedelics and language, as do the more prevalent accounts of synesthesia I've discussed earlier." And then I'll actually read one more sentence. "Psychedelics have some fundamental relationship to the way our brains create meaning and understanding out of sounds and images. Convinced that further investigations into this phenomenon would yield new insights." Could you expand on that? Because I would agree certainly with the assertion of this fundamental relationship. Any thoughts on LSD specifically as perhaps a tool for addressing dyslexia or psychedelics for any other indications that people might not guess?
The connection to LSD and language, and I think even more so with mushrooms, because you're probably familiar with an essay, I think by Henry Munn, that was published in a book called, I think it was by Peter First, called Hallucinogens and Culture. This was around 1970. There's a wonderful chapter in there called The Mushrooms of Language. It's by Henry Munn. And it makes the point, and again, like I talk about this in the Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, it makes the point that in this mushroom state, the poetry, the language becomes much more fluid. It just sort of flows out of you. And that's why these people can chant for hours, and they're actually instantiating, the mushroom is speaking through them. This gnosis, literally, the logos is the word. The pure logos actually flows through them. And then there's the phenomenon of synesthesia, which psychedelics, especially mushrooms, can reliably do. And, I've the association with meaningful images with sound. Some people are naturally, genetically synesthetic. And it's very interesting how their synesthetic experiences often have to do with words and numbers and things like that. And they'll say things like, well, the number 13 is chrome-shaped and spiky, shiny and spiky. What? But for them, that's a reality. And I think, I've argued that mushrooms, I have, Terence have, lots of people have, that mushrooms were important in the origin of consciousness. And I think that it is this connection to language, that consciousness depends, what we understand as true consciousness depends on this construction of this worldview, essentially. And that's built on language, this artificial reality that we construct for ourselves, that's a combination of sensory input that is filtered and processed in a certain way and linked to associations, memories, all of that kind of thing. So we build this, what the neuroscientists now call the default mode network, which is kind of ordinary state of consciousness. Long before I heard of the default mode network, I was calling it the reality hallucination. Effectively, we live in a hallucination. We live in an artificial world, reality that our brains construct. And it must reflect whatever is out there, because we're not wandering around stepping in front of buses and things like that. So it does map to reality in some ways, but it's actually an impoverished version of reality. A lot of what the brain does is filter things out, and Huxley had this insight. He talked about the reducing valve, that to make the world comprehensible, you have to selectively filter what gets in. And you inhabit this filtered, you could almost use the word curated version of reality. Otherwise, it would just be a blooming, buzzing confusion, and you wouldn't be able to navigate. And then you can take a psychedelic, you can disable those mechanisms. You can disable this default mode mechanism, open the gates of the reducing valve, and that can be very beneficial in terms of helping you get outside of your reference frame. And that's very useful. I think that's what psychedelics, I think that's where the therapeutic effect really, for many of the things it's indicated for, it's this ability to step outside your reference frame temporarily and look at your situation from a different perspective. And but you wouldn't want to be there all the time, right? Because you wouldn't be functional. That's, again, why you have to be very selective about your set and setting. When do you do these things? It's a complex topic because I think it does relate to the way that we link images, essentially internal images, to sounds and meaning, effectively, meaning. Because I'm here rapping to you, right? And I'm making effectively small mouth noises, which are inherently meaningless, except that we happen to share a language. And so when I make these small mouth noises, chances are your brain is reflecting it in terms of images. I say chair, you see a chair. I say star, you see a star. So, I mean, it's more complex than that, but I think that's the basis of cognition, really. And if you look at culture, if you look at consciousness, it's all based on this relationship between sound, image, and meaning, or what they sometimes call portentousness.
An ascribed meaning, right? It's a learned association that is not automatic, right? I think about this a lot with, say, infants and language, and I'm sure there's someone who can comment on this much more intelligently than I can, but when an infant, let's say before they develop full depth perception and so on, if they were to look at what's in front of me, they wouldn't see laptop, webcam, microphone, wood table, etc., pile of papers as discrete objects until they have, likely, at least not to that level of fidelity, until they have labels for those things, right? It might just be a flattened sort of two-dimensional sheet of colors and shapes and shadows. And I think about that quite a bit also as, you mentioned in the last episode that you've done who knows how many sessions with ayahuasca, 500 plus. And it does seem that people develop, or some people develop, an ability to discern and see in those spaces in the same way that an infant sort of develops the ability to discern between these kind of discrete things that we have labels for as adults.